My name is Harper. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, capable, and low maintenance. The kind of woman people assume will always understand, always adapt, always be fine. I work in a role that rewards consistency more than visibility, and I learned early how to move quietly through rooms without needing to be noticed. People often underestimate me, not because I'm weak, but because I don't announce my strength. I don't interrupt. I don't perform urgency. I let others speak first, decide first, and assume first. To some, that reads as compliance. To others, absence. Very few ever wondered what it took to live that way. This story isn't about revenge, and it isn't about righteousness. It's about consequence. It's about time. And it's about the moment you realize that loyalty, when unexamined, can slowly erase you. The title alone makes people uncomfortable. I chose a new relationship over seeing my mother before she died. I understand why. It sounds cold. It sounds final. But nothing about this story happened suddenly. And nothing about that choice was impulsive. By the time the moment arrived, the shape of my life had already shifted in ways I didn't fully understand yet. For a long time, I was busy building a future while erasing my past. Not dramatically, not angrily, just efficiently. One adjustment at a time. One postponed call, one missed train, one silence that lasted a little longer than the last. What you'll hear today is not a confession, and it's not a defense. It's an honest account of how someone becomes invisible inside their own family, how that invisibility gets mistaken for reliability, and how quiet people don't usually break, they withdraw. This story moves slowly because real emotional shifts do. There are no villains here, no shouting matches, no cinematic confrontations, just patterns that went unchallenged for years, and the cost of realizing them too late. You'll hear about the role I was assigned without being asked, the small cuts that didn't bleed but never healed, the moment I stopped explaining myself, and the calm, irreversible decision that followed, not out of anger, but clarity. If you're looking for drama, this won't give it to you. If you're looking for honesty, I can offer that. I'm not proud of every choice I made, but I understand them now. And understanding, I've learned, is sometimes the only justice available. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently. No need to answer out loud. Have you ever stayed so long in a role meant to keep the peace that you didn't notice when it started costing you your place in your own life? To my family, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. I was always there, always useful, never discussed. If something needed to be handled quietly, I handled it. If someone needed to be accommodated, I adjusted. I was the one people called when plans fell apart, not when plans were being made. They didn't say this outright. No one ever does. But roles like mine are rarely assigned with words. They're reinforced through repetition. Who gets consulted? Who gets informed after the fact? Who gets thanked for their patience instead of their opinion? In my family, I was the reasonable one. That label sounds flattering until you realize how often it's used to excuse overlooking you. Reasonable people don't get angry. Reasonable people don't demand. Reasonable people don't complicate things by needing too much. I learned early that my value came from how little friction I created. My younger brother was the sensitive one. My older sister was the ambitious one. My mother, she was the axis everything revolved around. Her moods, her health, her expectations. She didn't need to say what she wanted. The house learned to orbit her naturally, and I learned to stay slightly outside the frame. At holidays, I helped in the kitchen while decisions were made in the living room. At family discussions, I was asked to weigh in after everyone else had already aligned. My opinions were received kindly, then quietly disregarded. Not maliciously, just habitually. When I noticed, I told myself it didn't matter. I had my own life, my own work, my own apartment, my own routines. Independence became the excuse that justified my emotional distance. Harper's fine, they'd say. She doesn't need much. And because I rarely contradicted that, it became true in their eyes. What's strange is that invisibility doesn't feel painful at first. It feels efficient. You move faster when no one expects anything from you. You get good at anticipating needs, smoothing tensions, and absorbing inconvenience. You tell yourself, this is maturity, emotional intelligence, strength. I told myself that too. My mother relied on me in quiet ways. I was the one she called when she needed paperwork sorted, appointments scheduled, and explanations translated into something manageable. I wasn't the one she confided in emotionally. That role belonged to someone louder, more reactive. I was in logistics, infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't get thanked. It just gets used. I don't say this with bitterness. Not yet. At the time, I felt a certain pride in being the stable one, the one who didn't collapse under pressure, the one who could be trusted not to make things harder. But something subtle was happening beneath that pride. Every time my needs came last, I told myself it was temporary. Every time my absence went unnoticed, I reframed it as freedom. I was busy building a future, career progression, savings, relationships that felt uncomplicated. What I didn't realize was that I was also slowly erasing my past, not intentionally, not dramatically, just by not insisting on my place in it. Family photos were taken without me because I was parking the car. Decisions were made while I was at work. Stories were retold with my role minimized or omitted entirely. When I noticed, I laughed it off. Someone had to be easy. That someone was me. From the outside, my life looked balanced, calm, productive. I was admired for my composure. People described me as grounded, centered, and unshakable. No one asked what it cost to stay that way. And I didn't volunteer the answer. Because when you've spent years being valued for not needing much, admitting that you need anything feels like a betrayal of the role that keeps you included. So I stayed quiet. I stayed helpful. I stayed replaceable. At least, that's what I believed then. The first time I noticed it, I almost dismissed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There's no dramatic moment, no clear offense. Just a quiet realization that something landed differently than it should have. It happened over something ordinary. A phone call that came late in the evening. My mother's name lighting up the screen while I was in the middle of cooking dinner. I answered, already adjusting my posture, my tone, softening myself before she even spoke. She told me about a family decision that had already been made, not asked about, not discussed, decided. It involved her care plan for the coming year, appointments, living arrangements, responsibilities, things I would inevitably be involved in. things I had historically managed. She spoke quickly, efficiently, as if she were informing a colleague rather than a daughter. We didn't want to bother you, she said, almost cheerfully. You're always so busy. The word busy landed strangely. I was busy, yes, but not unavailable, not indifferent. I had never been. Yet, in that moment, my availability was reinterpreted as distance, my silence as consent. I remember standing there with the phone pressed to my ear, the pan cooling on the stove, realizing I had been edited out of a conversation I was expected to support. I said nothing, not because I didn't feel something, but because I couldn't yet name it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hurt, it was displacement. Like stepping into a room and noticing the furniture had been rearranged without anyone telling you. After we hung up, I stared at the wall longer than necessary. I replayed her words, looking for malice. There was none, just an assumption. That was the first cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. I mentioned it casually to my sister a few days later, framing it as an observation rather than a complaint. She laughed softly, the way people do when they think you're overthinking. You know, Mom, she said, she just doesn't want to impose. And there it was, the reframing. The way concern becomes courtesy. The way exclusion gets repackaged as consideration. I nodded. I let it go. Because pushing back would have required explaining something I wasn't sure I was allowed to feel. Because being reasonable meant accepting explanations that smoothed things over, even when they didn't fit. After that, similar moments began to appear. Emails were forwarded to me after decisions were finalized. Plans were adjusted without consulting my schedule. Assumptions made about my flexibility, my willingness, my silence. Each one was minor. Each one is plausible. Each one is easy to excuse. And that's how normalization begins. Not with cruelty, but convenience. No one was trying to hurt me. That's what made it harder to speak up. Hurt implies intent. This was something else. This was erosion. I started noticing how often my mother spoke about me instead of to me. How my role was described as a given, not a choice. Harper can handle it. Harper won't mind. And because I rarely contradicted those statements, they solidified. There was a moment, small, almost laughable now, when my brother thanked me for being low drama. He meant it as praise. I smiled and accepted it. But later, alone, I wondered when having feelings had become synonymous with causing problems. I didn't confront anyone, not then. Instead, I adjusted inward. I paid closer attention. I started remembering things instead of brushing them off. I stopped immediately translating discomfort into understanding. That first cut didn't change me, not visibly, but it marked the beginning of something I could no longer unsee. Once you notice how easily your presence can be removed from a narrative, you start to question how firmly you were ever written into it at all. And still, I stayed, because leaving wasn't even a concept yet. After the first few moments, I stopped calling them cuts. Cuts imply injury. Injury implies something that demands care. This didn't feel like that. It felt like the weather, predictable, mild, easy to prepare for if you dress correctly. So I did what I'd always done. I adapted. When plans were made without me, I adjusted my schedule. When assumptions were made about my availability, I reshaped my priorities. When my mother spoke as if my presence were optional, but my labor inevitable, I translated it into practicality. She's under stress. This isn't personal. It's just easier this way. That last one became my favorite explanation. Easy for whom? I never asked. The pattern settled in quietly. I would hear about decisions after they were finalized, usually accompanied by a light apology. My response was always the same: measured, calm, reassuring. It's fine, I'd say. I understand. And I did understand. I understood that challenging it would create friction. I understood that friction would be interpreted as selfishness. I understood that I had been cast as the person who didn't complicate things, and any deviation from that role would be noticed immediately. So I stayed consistent. Consistency is powerful. It teaches people how to treat you. I became so reliable in my silence that it stopped registering as silence at all. It was just the background hum of things functioning smoothly. My presence was assumed. My agreement was implied. At some point, I realized I was no longer being overlooked. I was being used as a constant. Constants don't get consulted, they get calculated around. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Small openings in conversations where I could have said, "Next time, I'd like to be included," or "That doesn't work for me." But the words never felt urgent enough. The cost of saying them seemed higher than the discomfort of swallowing them. So I swallowed. I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace, I learned, can be a one-sided agreement. My mother's health became more fragile during this time. That fact alone reorganized the family hierarchy. Needs intensified. Emotions heightened. And my role solidified further into logistics and containment. I was the one who kept track of dates, who remembered the instructions, who explained things twice so others wouldn't have to ask again. I was praised for my efficiency, my calm, my ability to handle things. What I wasn't asked was how handling things was changing me. When I did express mild hesitation, nothing dramatic, just a suggestion that I might not be available, I was met with surprise, as if the idea itself was foreign. "But you always manage," my sister said once, genuinely confused. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. I always managed. And because I always managed, no one felt the need to manage me. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as certainty. Certainty that you will adapt. Certainty that you won't push back. Certainty that your life can bend without breaking. And because I didn't break, they assumed it didn't bend at all. I began to feel a strange kind of distance growing. Not anger, not resentment, but detachment. Like watching a familiar routine play out from just far enough away that you notice its flaws. I started documenting things privately, not in a ledger, not with intention, just mentally. Who decided what? Who spoke? Who listened? Who was thanked? Patterns become obvious when you stop excusing them. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, something was shifting. I stopped volunteering extra explanations. I stopped preemptively smoothing things over. I responded, but I didn't anticipate. It was subtle, probably invisible, but it was the first time my silence wasn't automatic. It was chosen, and choice, once introduced, has a way of changing everything that follows. It became clear to me one afternoon, in the least dramatic way possible. We were sitting around my mother's kitchen table, papers spread out between us. Medical forms, schedules, notes scribbled in different handwriting. Everyone was talking at once, overlapping, interrupting, negotiating. I was quiet, listening, as I always did. At some point, my mother turned to me and said, almost absent mindedly, Harper will take care of the rest. No discussion, no eye contact, just a conclusion. No one questioned it, not even me. That was the moment I understood the role I'd been assigned. I wasn't a decision maker. I wasn't a participant. I was the fail-safe, the contingency plan, the person who absorbed whatever was left once everyone else had taken what they needed. Reliable, useful, invisible. The realization didn't hurt the way you'd expect. It was clarifying, like finally seeing the shape of something that had been pressing against you for years. Once I named the role, I saw it everywhere. I was included in conversations just enough to be informed, never enough to influence. My opinions were welcomed in theory, filtered in practice. I was thanked for my flexibility more than my contribution. Flexibility, I realized, was just another word for expected sacrifice. My mother didn't intend this. I'm careful to say that. She had lived her whole life managing strong personalities. She leaned toward the path of least resistance, and I had made myself that path. She trusted me to adapt. She trusted me not to leave. Trust can be a burden when it's built on the assumption that you will always stay. I began to notice how often my needs were framed as negotiable, while everyone else's were treated as fixed. Schedules could bend for me, boundaries could shift. I was understanding, which meant I was expected to understand, always. When I tried to imagine stepping out of that role, I felt an immediate wave of guilt. Who would handle things if I didn't? Who would translate the chaos into something manageable? The family system depended on my quiet compliance more than I'd realized, and that dependence gave me an uncomfortable kind of power, one I had never acknowledged before. I wasn't loud enough to be feared. I wasn't emotional enough to be managed. I wasn't demanding enough to be negotiated with. I was taken for granted. There's a strange safety in being taken for granted. As long as you perform the role well, you're needed. But you're also replaceable in theory, even if not in practice. I wondered, for the first time, what would happen if I stopped? Not dramatically, not angrily, just stopped filling the gaps. The thought unsettled me. I had built my identity around being the person who made things work. If I stepped away from that, who was I? That question lingered longer than any of the others. I didn't announce a change. I didn't challenge the assumption at the table that day. I nodded, gathered the papers, and took them home. But something had been named. And once named, it couldn't be ignored. I wasn't being overlooked because I was insignificant. I was being relied upon because I was convenient. And convenience, I was beginning to understand, is not the same as care. That distinction didn't make me angry. It made me precise. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where everything cracked open and spilled out. If you'd been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days I usually visited my mother after work. Not because she asked me to, but because it fit. Because it made things easier for everyone. Because I had shaped my life around availability without ever formally agreeing to do so. That day, I was late. Work had run long, unexpected, unavoidable. By the time I left the office, the sky had already darkened into that early evening gray that feels heavier than night. I checked my phone at a red light and saw 3 missed calls from my sister and 1 text from my mother. Are you coming? No context. No concern, just expectation. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not guilt, recognition. I replied that I'd be late, that I could come another day. The response came quickly. We were counting on you. No, I was hoping to see you. Are you okay? We were counting on you. I pulled over before answering, sat there with the engine idling, the dashboard clock glowing steadily, indifferent to my hesitation. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain. I didn't justify. I didn't apologize. I typed, I can't tonight, and I sent it. That was all. The world didn't collapse. No emergency followed. No crisis erupted. Things adjusted. When I arrived home, the apartment felt quieter than usual. Not empty, neutral. I stood in the kitchen, still in my coat, and noticed how unfamiliar it felt to prioritize my own limits without cushioning the impact for others. There was discomfort, yes. Guilt hovered at the edges, looking for a place to land. But something else was there too, relief. It startled me. I had expected anxiety. Instead, I felt space. That night, I thought about how rarely anyone had asked what worked for me, how often my availability had been assumed instead of requested, how quickly concern had turned into obligation. I realized that I had been mistaking responsibility for connection. Responsibility keeps things running. Connection requires presence, mutuality, and choice. I had been offering the first and hoping for the second. Lying in bed, I replayed the message. We were counting on you. Not malicious, not manipulative, just revealing. It wasn't about missing me, it was about missing my function. That distinction settled heavily, but cleanly, like a truth you don't want but can't refute. The next few days passed without incident. No one mentioned that evening, no apology, no acknowledgement that I had declined. The absence of reaction told me more than confrontation ever could. I wasn't expected to say no, but when I did, the system absorbed it without inquiry. That meant my presence was valued for what it enabled, not what it represented. Something shifted quietly inside me. I began to ask myself different questions. Not, how can I help? But do I want to? Not what's easiest, but what's fair. These weren't rebellious thoughts. They were measured, adult, long overdue. I didn't withdraw completely. I didn't announce new boundaries. I simply stopped overriding myself automatically. If a request conflicted with my life, I paused. If a plan was made without me, I resisted the urge to rearrange everything to accommodate it. Each small choice reinforced the same realization. I had been participating in my own erasure, and participation can be withdrawn. Not with drama, not with punishment, with clarity. That Tuesday didn't change my circumstances, it changed my posture. And from there, everything else followed. Once silence stops being automatic, it becomes noticeable, even to yourself. I began to feel the difference almost immediately. Before, my quiet had been reflexive, a conditioned response. Now, every pause carried intention. Every withheld explanation was deliberate. I still showed up. I still answered calls. But I no longer rushed to fill gaps in conversations or smooth over discomfort before it had fully formed. I let silence sit where it landed. Other people often mistake that kind of silence for weakness. They assume you have nothing to say. What they don't realize is that you finally decided not to say everything. My family didn't comment on the change at first. They couldn't. It was too subtle. I hadn't transformed overnight. I hadn't become distant or cold. I was still helpful, just not preemptively. Requests came. I considered them. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I didn't. When I declined, I didn't over explain. I can't, I'd say. Or, that won't work for me. No justification. No apology. The reactions were small but telling. A pause. A recalibration. Occasionally, surprise. I noticed how often people relied on my discomfort to motivate me. How frequently guilt had been the engine behind my availability. Without that fuel, things moved differently. I also noticed something else. No one asked why I'd changed. They assumed it was temporary. Stress, work, a phase. That assumption gave me cover. I listened more than I spoke. I observed how quickly responsibility shifted when I didn't immediately step in. How others adapted when they had to. The world didn't fall apart. That was the most important lesson. For years, I had believed my silence was what kept things stable. In reality, it was what kept me manageable. Choosing silence changed its function. It was no longer a shield to avoid conflict. It was a boundary that required no explanation. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been voiced. I stopped reminding people of things they could remember themselves. I stopped volunteering my time as a default offering. Each small withdrawal felt almost invisible, but it wasn't. I was reclaiming energy I hadn't realized I'd been spending. There was fear, too. Fear that if I didn't remain indispensable, I'd become irrelevant. Fear that the connection was conditional on usefulness. That fear had kept me compliant for a long time, but now I was testing it. If I spoke less, would I be missed or just noticed less? The answer arrived slowly, in fragments. Some interactions grew awkward. Without my usual scaffolding, conversations stalled. Plans took longer to finalize. Small frictions surfaced that I had previously absorbed. No one thanked me for the difference. They didn't know where it came from. But I felt it. I had more time, more mental clarity, more distance between other people's expectations and my own sense of obligation. Silence, I learned, can be strategic without being manipulative. It can be an act of respect for yourself. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just no longer cushioning the impact of their assumptions. The most revealing moment came when my mother said, "You've been quiet lately." There was no accusation in her voice, just observation. I looked at her and said, "I've been listening." It was true, listening to what was being asked, listening to what was being assumed, listening to what was never offered in return. That silence changed how I heard everything else, and it prepared me for what came next. Because once you stop filling every space, you start to see what others never bothered to notice. When you stop performing your role at full volume, people rarely look closer. They look away. That's what made this next phase possible. My silence didn't register as a shift in agency. It registered as absence of stress or preoccupation or fatigue, something temporary, something that would resolve itself. So no one adjusted their behavior toward me. They didn't become more attentive. They didn't ask what I needed. They simply assumed I was managing, as I always had. And because they assumed that, they stopped paying attention. That was when I began preparing, not for confrontation, not for departure, at least not consciously. Preparation started as observation, then documentation, then positioning. Quiet, methodical, almost boring in its consistency. I began to keep track of responsibilities I had absorbed over the years, not emotionally, practically. Who relied on me for what? What systems did I maintain without acknowledgement? Which relationships depended on my availability rather than mutual engagement? I noticed how often my presence was required, but my consent was implied rather than requested. At work, this kind of mapping came naturally to me. Processes, dependencies, failure points. I had built a career on noticing what others overlooked. I applied the same lens to my personal life. I stopped reminding my family of deadlines unless asked. I stopped translating medical language unless someone requested help. I let others experience the friction of handling things themselves. They did, slowly, inconsistently, uncomfortably. But they did, and nothing terrible happened. That realization was both liberating and sobering. It meant my role, while useful, was not irreplaceable. It also meant that the expectation that I would always fill it had never been questioned, because it had never needed to be. I also started investing more deeply in parts of my life that existed outside my family's gravitational pull. My relationship at the time, new, tentative, still forming, became a place where I was seen differently, not as a resource, but as a person. My presence was chosen, not assumed. That contrast sharpened everything. With him, my time was requested. My boundaries were respected. When I said no, it didn't require justification. When I was quiet, it prompted curiosity, not confusion. I didn't talk about my family much, not because I was hiding them, but because I was noticing how little of myself I had left when I did. I was busy building a future, and I could feel the past loosening its grip. I updated the documents. I organized personal records. I separated logistical threads that had long been intertwined. Things I told myself were simply responsible adult tasks. In truth, I was reducing points of dependency. I didn't announce this. I didn't frame it as a decision. It was instinctual, the kind of preparation that happens when your body understands something before your mind is ready to articulate it. What they never noticed was how much of the family's smooth functioning had been invisible labor, emotional labor, administrative labor, anticipatory labor. When that labor slowed, they experienced inconvenience, but not insight. No one connected the dots. They didn't notice that I stopped being the first to respond, that I no longer preemptively solved problems, that my answers became shorter and more precise. They didn't notice that I was reclaiming myself, and that lack of notice was its own confirmation. I wasn't withdrawing to be seen. I was withdrawing because I had finally seen clearly. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from understanding leverage without needing to use it, from knowing that you could change things, not explosively, not publicly, but decisively. I didn't want chaos, I wanted alignment. And alignment, I was beginning to understand, sometimes requires separation. By the time the private realization arrived, the one that would crystallize everything, I had already shifted my internal center of gravity. I just hadn't named it yet. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By then, I had already felt the quiet distance settling into place. I had already begun living as if certain expectations no longer applied to me. What I hadn't yet done was admit, to myself, what that meant. The moment arrived in a hospital hallway. I was sitting alone, back against a wall that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee gone cold. My mother was in another room, asleep. The doctors had spoken in careful tones earlier that day, measured, professional, non-committal in the way that still carries weight. I wasn't afraid. That surprised me. I was attentive, focused, calm, but fear never fully arrived. Instead, there was a deep, quiet awareness settling into my chest. I realized, sitting there, that I had already grieved something long before that day. Not her. US. The version of our relationship I had spent years protecting, hoping would eventually become reciprocal, had ended without ceremony. And because it had ended slowly, I hadn't noticed when the grief began. That was the reveal. I wasn't avoiding closeness out of self protection. I had already accepted the limits of what this relationship could offer me. And acceptance changes obligation. I thought back over the years. How often my mother had relied on me without asking. How rarely she had asked how I was doing without needing something in return. How concern had always been practical, never curious. She loved me. I don't question that. But love, unexamined, can still be unequal. Sitting there, I understood something with absolute clarity. If nothing changed, I would continue to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough at a time that one day I would look back and realize I had lived someone else's version of a good daughter instead of my own version of a whole person. There was no anger in this realization, just finality. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my partner, not my siblings, not even myself out loud. But I made a quiet decision. I would stop measuring my worth by my usefulness. I would stop performing closeness that wasn't being offered in return. And when the moment came, when choice became unavoidable, I would choose the life I was building, not the role I was leaving behind. That decision didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel honest. I sat there until visiting hours ended, then left without ceremony. No one questioned it. No one asked me to stay longer. Someone else would take over. They always did. As I walked to my car, I noticed how steady my breathing was, how intact I felt. I wasn't running away. I was standing still. From that point on, everything became clearer. Not easier, clearer. I no longer framed my actions around what would be expected of me in a crisis. I framed them around what I could live with afterward. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't justify it. I simply began living as if my time, my presence, my emotional energy were finite and valuable. Because they were. The reveal wasn't about leverage over others, it was about leverage over myself. And once I had that, I didn't need permission to move forward. There is a moment after clarity arrives when you're forced to choose what to do with it. Not dramatically, not urgently, but decisively. For me, that moment came quietly, spread over several weeks. There was no single day when everything converged. Instead, there were overlapping realities pulling in opposite directions, each demanding allegiance. My mother's condition was worsening, slowly, unevenly, the way things do when there's still room for hope, but no guarantee it will be useful. Updates came through group messages. Appointments were scheduled. Roles were reinforced. At the same time, my life elsewhere was solidifying. My relationship deepened, not through grand gestures, but through reliability that felt mutual. We planned things together, not just weekends, but months. The future stopped being abstract. At work, I was being considered for a role that required more travel, more presence, more commitment. The kind of opportunity that assumes your personal life can accommodate it, or that you're willing to shape it accordingly. Two paths were forming, one familiar, one deliberate, and I could no longer pretend they were compatible. The decision wasn't framed as choosing my partner over my mother. That language came later, imposed by others. At the time, it felt more precise than that. I was choosing between an identity built on obligation and one built on consent, between being necessary and being present, between a role I had never agreed to and a life I was actively building. I didn't rush it. I let the options sit side by side without trying to reconcile them. I noticed how each one made me feel, not emotionally, but physically. When I imagined centering my life around my mother's decline, I felt a familiar tightening, a contraction, not fear, but resignation. When I imagined continuing forward, allowing others to step in, allowing myself to step back, I felt steadier. Sad, yes, but not diminished. Sadness I could carry, disappearance I could not. The final push came during a conversation that was meant to be logistical. Dates, schedules, expectations. My presence was assumed again, this time more explicitly. "We'll need you here," my sister said. Not a question, a plan. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable, but not confrontational. "I can't commit to that," I said finally. The reaction was immediate. Surprise, confusion, concern, framed as disbelief. "What do you mean? You're her daughter. She needs you." All true, and still not complete. "I won't be available in the way you're expecting," I said. Calmly, clearly. There was no argument, just a subtle shift in tone. As if a variable had changed unexpectedly in an equation everyone else had already solved. That was the decision point. Not when I said no to a visit, not when I chose one city over another, but when I stopped allowing obligation to override intention. I didn't announce a final boundary. I didn't make ultimatums. I didn't justify my reasoning beyond what was necessary. I simply stopped offering myself as the default solution. That choice didn't make me feel victorious. It made me feel accountable to my own life. And once that accountability existed, there was no returning to who I had been before. After the decision, there was no announcement. That's the part people rarely understand. They expect a declaration, a confrontation, some visible line drawn in the sand. But the kind of choice I had made didn't need witnesses. It needed execution. So I moved in silence. Outwardly, very little changed. I still answered messages. I still showed up when I said I would. I still spoke kindly, calmly, without tension. If someone had asked whether anything was wrong, I would have said no. And it would have been true. Nothing was wrong. Something was simply different. What changed first were the structures beneath the surface. I stopped positioning my life around proximity. I confirmed commitments that anchored me where I was building, not where I was expected to return. Travel plans were finalized. Work responsibilities expanded. My calendar, once flexible by default, became specific. Specificity is a form of boundary that doesn't argue. I updated legal documents quietly. Nothing dramatic, just alignment. Emergency contacts, powers of attorney, clear lines of responsibility that no longer defaulted to me unless explicitly chosen. No one noticed. Why would they? These were things I had always handled. The assumption that I would continue to do so worked in my favor now. It created space for me to reassign weight without triggering an alarm. Emotionally, I did something just as important. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. For years, part of my energy had been spent anticipating questions, managing reactions, softening outcomes before they arrived. I let that go. I accepted that the misunderstanding was not a failure on my part. If people wanted clarity, they could ask. They didn't. That silence told me everything I needed to know. As my mother's condition declined further, updates came through others. I responded when appropriate. I expressed concern. I offered support that didn't require self erasure, but I no longer centered myself in the narrative of her care. That role passed to others naturally, unevenly, imperfectly. And still, the system held. There were moments of discomfort, gaps, where I would once have stepped in. I resisted the urge, not out of cruelty, but discipline. Moving in silence requires restraint. It requires trusting that the choice you've made doesn't need constant reinforcement. At times, guilt surfaced, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present. I acknowledged it without letting it steer me. Guilt is a signal, not a command. I didn't stop loving my mother. I stopped confusing love with self abandonment. My relationship continued to deepen, not because I was choosing it over something else, but because I was finally choosing it without apology. We talked about the future as something real, not hypothetical. Plans had edges now, timelines. I felt rooted. No one from my family confronted me during this time. No one accused me of pulling away. The absence of confrontation was almost surreal. It meant one thing: they still believed I was available. They just hadn't needed to test it yet. And that was fine, because by then, my life was already in motion. Silence isn't emptiness, it's preparation. And I was prepared. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation, they arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle: missed connections, delayed responses, small things slipping through the cracks that had never existed before. Appointments overlapped, instructions were misunderstood, details were forgotten. Not catastrophically, just enough to be felt. I would hear about these things later, usually framed as mild frustration. It's been a little chaotic lately. Things feel disorganized. We're still figuring out the new rhythm. No one said my name in those sentences, but I heard it anyway. When you remove a silent stabilizer from a system, the system doesn't collapse, it wobbles. And people rarely look for what's missing, they look for what's malfunctioning. My sister sounded more tired when she called, shorter, less certain. She asked questions she'd never needed to ask before. Questions I used to answer automatically. This time, I answered selectively, not coldly, not defensively, just honestly. I'm not sure, I'd say. Or, you might want to check with the doctor's office. Each time, there was a pause on the other end of the line, a recalibration. I could feel the shift happening, not as resentment, but realization. They were beginning to feel the weight I had carried without ever seeing it. Still, no one addressed it directly. That would have required acknowledging that the balance had changed. Instead, there were indirect signals, comments about how much there was to manage, casual remarks about how things used to run more smoothly, nostalgia disguised as observation. I listened without responding. This wasn't punishment, it was a consequence. There's a difference. Punishment is imposed, consequence emerges. The most telling moment came when someone said, "We didn't realize how much you were doing." It wasn't said to me, it was said about me. That distinction mattered. Recognition, when it comes too late, doesn't heal. It clarifies. I felt a brief flicker of sadness, not vindication, not relief, just a quiet acknowledgement that my absence had become visible only after it was no longer reversible. And I didn't step back in, not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't. Stepping back in would have restored comfort at the cost of truth. It would have re-established the old equilibrium, one that required my invisibility to function. I had already left that version of myself behind. My mother, during this time, asked about me once. Just once. Is Harper coming this week? The question was relayed to me later, filtered through someone else's voice. By the time it reached me, It sounded less like a desire and more like a disruption to expectations. I said I wouldn't be. No justification followed. No one argued. That silence, on their end this time, was the clearest consequence of all. They were beginning to understand that I was no longer automatically available, that my absence wasn't temporary. Those things would have to continue without me filling every gap. I wasn't erased anymore. I was missing. And missing is different. Missing invites reflection. Erasure invites nothing. As the weeks passed, the system adjusted again, awkwardly, imperfectly, but persistently. New routines formed, responsibilities redistributed. Life went on. It always does. And in that continuation, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because things were easy, not because everything was resolved, but because the consequences unfolding were no longer mine to manage. I had made my choice. Now others were living with the shape of it. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like urgency disguised as concern, like sudden availability, like questions that arrived too late to be useful. By the time the tone changed, the structure had already shifted. Messages started coming more frequently, not demands, requests, softer now, carefully worded, as if language itself could undo momentum. Can you come this weekend? She keeps asking for you. It would mean a lot. Meaning, I noticed, had finally replaced assumption. But meaning isn't retroactive. I read those messages slowly. I didn't avoid them. I didn't rush to respond either. I felt the familiar pull, the old instinct to compress my life back into the shape others preferred. And then I felt something stronger. Finality, not cruelty, not indifference, just the understanding that some thresholds, once crossed, can't be uncrossed without cost. If I returned now, not as a visitor, but as a stabilizer, I would be reinstating a role that had already dissolved. I would be teaching everyone, including myself, that my boundaries were temporary inconveniences rather than structural changes. I couldn't do that, so I answered honestly, I won't be able to come. The replies that followed weren't angry, they were unsettled. Confusion crept into the language. Appeals to duty, to timing, to regret. You don't want this to be something you carry forever. You might not get another chance. They weren't wrong, but they were late. Those conversations assume that the only regret worth avoiding is theirs. They don't account for the regret of self erasure, of abandoning the life you're building in order to preserve a role that never fully held you. I thought about the years I had shown up without being asked, about the quiet accommodations that had shaped my adulthood, about how long it had taken for anyone to notice my absence, and how quickly they wanted it reversed once they did. Fixing things, I realized, would require me to become invisible again. That wasn't repaired. That was repetition. The urgency escalated as my mother's condition declined further. The language shifted from preference to fear, from suggestion to emotional accounting. She's asking for you. You'll regret this. Those words landed heavier, not because they were manipulative, but because they were true in a way that mattered. I would regret something. The question was, which regret could I live with? Regret for not returning to a role that cost me myself? Or regret for not being present at the end of a relationship that had already asked everything of me? I chose the regret that didn't require me to disappear. That choice didn't make me feel strong. It made me feel adult. There were no more attempts after that. The realization set in, not all at once, but gradually, that the old solution wasn't available anymore. I wasn't withholding out of spite. I was unavailable by design, and design, once implemented, doesn't yield to urgency. I thought about my mother often during that time, not in guilt ridden spirals, but in quiet reflection. I remembered her strengths, her limitations, the ways she loved, and the ways she didn't know how to. I didn't hate her. I simply stopped sacrificing myself to prove that I loved her. By the time the call slowed, it was clear that fixing things, returning to the old dynamic, was no longer possible. Not because I refused, but because I had already changed. And change, once integrated, doesn't negotiate. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its simplicity. No raised voices, no accusations, no emotional collapse. Just two people sitting across from each other, realizing they were no longer speaking from the same place. It was my sister who asked to meet, not urgently, not dramatically. A message that said, "Can we talk?" As if talking had ever been the issue. We met at a quiet cafe, the kind designed for conversations that don't want an audience. She looked tired, not frantic, not angry, just worn down by a weight she had only recently begun to feel. "I don't understand," she said after a while. "You've always been there." That sentence carried years inside it. "I know," I replied. She waited for more, an explanation, a defense, something emotional enough to justify the discomfort she was feeling. I didn't give her that. "I didn't leave suddenly," I said. "I stopped compensating." She frowned, not in anger, but confusion, as if the language itself were unfamiliar. "We needed you," she said. "I know," I said again. "And I needed to stop being the only one who adjusted." There was a long pause, the kind that usually prompts someone to soften their words, to rush in and ease the tension. I didn't. She tried a different angle. "Do you know how this looks?" I did. It looked like abandonment. It looked like selfishness. It looked like choosing a relationship over family. "I do," I said, "and I'm okay with that." That was the moment she really looked at me, not as the reliable one, not as the backup, but as someone who had made a decision she couldn't undo. "You could still come," she said quietly. "Even now." I shook my head, not dramatically, just once. "If I do," I said, "it won't be because I want to. It'll be because I'm expected to. And I won't live like that anymore." She didn't argue. That was the strangest part. She exhaled slowly, as if letting go of a position she had been holding out of habit rather than belief. "I didn't realize how much we leaned on you," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's why it worked." There was no satisfaction in that exchange, no sense of victory, just acknowledgement. Confrontation doesn't always need heat to be real. Sometimes it just needs clarity and the refusal to dilute it for comfort. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. "You're different," she said. "I am," I agreed. And that was all. No apology, no forgiveness ceremony, no reconciliation narrative. Just two people accepting that the dynamic between them had changed, and that not all change requires consensus. I walked away feeling neither heavy nor light, just finished. I don't describe myself as someone who walked away. That implies trauma, escape, a single decisive break. What I did was quieter than that. I stayed and I changed. The life I live now doesn't look revolutionary from the outside. I work, I love, I plan, I show up where I choose to. The difference is not in the shape of my days, but in who they belong to. I no longer build my identity around being needed. I build it around being present, by choice. The relationship I chose didn't rescue me. It didn't replace my family. It didn't fill some dramatic void. It simply met me where I was, without requiring me to shrink to fit. That changed everything. I'm still capable, still reliable, still observant. Those traits didn't disappear when I stopped being invisible. They just stopped being exploited. I give help now without resentment because I give it freely. When I say no, I don't rehearse guilt afterward. When I'm quiet, it's not because I'm suppressing something, it's because there's nothing left unsaid. My mother did pass away. I won't soften that. I wasn't there in the way people expect daughters to be. I was present in a way I could live with. I held her in thought, not in logistics. I grieved without returning to a role that had already cost me too much. Some people will never understand that distinction. I've made peace with that. Understanding isn't owed, integrity is. The family dynamic never returned to what it was. It couldn't. Once a system reveals its dependence on someone's silence, that silence can't be restored without consequence. We are more distant now, not hostile, just honest in a way we weren't before. I am no longer the unspoken solution. I am a person with a life that has weight. That weight is something I carry with care. I don't tell this story to justify myself. I tell it because quiet people are often misunderstood. Their boundaries are mistaken for absence, their restraint for indifference, their choices for cruelty. What they rarely get credit for is the discipline it takes to stop disappearing. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is the most stable form of self-respect. There are stories people tell themselves about what love should look like, that it should be selfless, endless, quietly sacrificial, that if you're capable of carrying more, you should, without complaint, without limit. I believed that story for a long time. It's an easy story to live inside, especially if you're good at endurance. Especially if you've been praised your whole life for being strong, reasonable, the one who can handle it. But endurance isn't the same thing as devotion and sacrifice, when it's expected rather than chosen, stops being love and starts becoming erasure. The hardest truth I had to accept was this: no one was going to stop me from disappearing. Not because they were cruel, but because the version of me that disappeared made their lives easier. That realization didn't turn me bitter. It made me responsible, responsible for my own presence, responsible for the life I was building, responsible for choosing relationships that didn't require me to dissolve in order to belong. I didn't abandon my mother. I stopped abandoning myself. Both things can be true, even if they make people uncomfortable. There's a kind of morality that prioritizes appearances over integrity, that values staying at any cost over staying honest, that judges choose by how well they preserve roles rather than by how they preserve people. I don't live by that morality anymore. I live by one that asks a quieter question. Can I live with this version of myself afterward? That question doesn't always lead to the most socially acceptable answer, but it leads to the most sustainable one. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: being needed is not the same as being valued. Being present is not the same as being available. And love that requires you to disappear is not love you are obligated to perform. Some regrets are loud and immediate, others are silent and lifelong. I chose the regret that allowed me to remain intact. If you've ever found yourself in a role that kept the peace while costing you your place, if you've ever been praised for being easy while quietly shrinking, I want you to know this. You're not wrong for wanting more. You're not cruel for choosing differently. And you're not alone in learning this later than you wish you had. I'm curious, truly. Have you ever had to choose between fulfilling a role and honoring who you were becoming? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear how you navigated that choice.